Okay. So welcome to Unit Menus, Empowering Students Through Choice. What I'm going to do is I'm also going to share the Nearpod screen so that we have it for the recording. But everybody should be logged into the Nearpod. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize, just give me one moment here. Okay, so welcome. I'm so happy that you're here. So I have a few thank yous before we get started today. So I want to thank very, very much Kristen Vanderveen for having me here today. Thank you for all the support you've given me over the last year. You've been just so influential for me and helping my chemistry students. Obviously, I want to thank the rest of the NEAC team for putting this wonderful conference together. I'm so excited to go to some of the other sessions. And then I want to take a moment to thank all of you for being here. I'm always so inspired by teachers, the fact that they give up their personal and professional time to come to these meetings just for the betterment of their students. And it's really just so inspiring to me. So thank you. Your students are incredibly lucky to have you. So to tell you a little bit more about myself, I didn't realize that Kristen was going to do an introduction, but I'm a chemistry teacher at Hillsborough High School. I've been teaching chemistry for about 15 years. I taught a lot of different levels of chemistry, including college prep honors and advanced placement. I'm also my district's turnkey trainer. So I teach teachers how to integrate technology and different strategies into their classroom. As far as my teaching style, I am a former chalk and talk teacher, but now I really engage my students in student-centered learning. I do a bit of asynchronous learning in my classroom. I love to incorporate student choice, as you all know, and I do incorporate elements of the flipped classroom. My favorite tech tools for creating and implementing unit menus is the QR code generator, which is an extension, Google Forms, and Edpuzzle, all of which I'm going to talk about in this presentation. If you'd like to connect with me, you can absolutely feel free to connect with me on my Twitter at Miss Randazzo, and I'd be happy to collaborate with you. So one of the great features about Nearpod is we can collaborate, and your name will not be shared when you answer this question, but I just always like to kind of see where everyone's coming from, what your I guess, part in choice and using choice in your classroom. What do you have you used it before? Do you feel comfortable using it? So I'm going to ask you to just type in a response, and I'm not going to kind of preview what you're saying beforehand because you're all adult learners. I'm sure I don't need to say that, but while you do this, that's one of the cool things about Nearpod is that you can control what's posted to the collaborative board. But my question to you today is, what are your learning goals for today's session? You can consider sharing if you've used choice before. What information do you hope to bring back to your classroom? And if you agree with anything that you see here, feel free to hit that little heart. Great, a lot of great comments. Fantastic. So it looks like we have a lot of different experiences here with choice. Great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And then obviously this is your professional development session. So if there's something that I haven't covered or you want to know more about, I'd be happy to talk more with you. You can absolutely feel free to type something in the chat, and I'll be checking in with you periodically throughout the presentation. So here are some goals that I thought about for today's session. Obviously, the description kind of alludes to some of these, but my hope is to help you explain the purpose of a menu and its role in empowering students, identify best practices in unit menu design and function. So I'm actually going to show you a menu on some artifacts from my classroom and how you can kind of cater them to your needs. Also, identify how to promote student buy-in for unit menus. I'm one of the only teachers in my department that uses choice. So it's important to have some talking points because this is such a new and interesting idea for many students. We'll also talk about some effective procedures and norms when engaging with menus and how you can effectively track student progress throughout the menu. So what I want to do right now is share a video with you. And I still remember the day that I was on the treadmill at the gym and this video popped up in my news feed. And I was thinking to myself, wow, what an amazing concept. So I'm going to give you a moment. I'm going to make it so that you can play it on your device and I'm going to mute myself. And it's, I want to say it's about 4 minutes. So just take a moment and watch this if you will.
Hey, Karen, for some reason, I'm not getting any audio on the video. Would you be able to share a direct link to it in the chat?
Yes, I can. Hold on, let me see if I can access it via YouTube. Give me one moment.
Thanks.
I know some of you got a late start watching that video. I feel that it's worth watching the entire thing. So if you have a little bit of time and you want to check out the entire thing, I think that would be a great thing. But just because I want to be respectful of your time, I am going to continue with the presentation. So for me, that video was really empowering because I wanted to be a different science teacher than I was at the time. I spent a lot of time lecturing my students in real time. And to me, in thinking about what science looks like, it doesn't look like somebody standing up and lecturing all the time. Instead, students should be really engaged in the scientific process. And so now at this point, I try to engage my students in learning science by doing science, all keeping in mind the 5 C's that he's talking about. So let's talk about what a unit menu is. The best definition that I can come up with is that it's an instructional tool that promotes student accountability, ownership over learning, differentiation, and student choice. And you may have heard this be referred to maybe as a choice board or a learning menu. For the unit menu, this obviously would teach an entire unit worth of content. However, you could absolutely split it up however you'd like. If you'd maybe prefer to do half of a unit, which I have in the past, I think that's a great thing to do. You really have to do what works best for you and your students. So in talking about that video that we just took a little look at, one of the best things that I think that comes from a menu is that your students are learning how to learn. I mean, let's be honest, as chemistry teachers, it would be great if our students could remember how to perform a solution stoichiometry calculation or predict the geometry of molecules. But really, at the end of the day, when we think about what our students should really leave our classrooms with, it's about how to learn something difficult. And chemistry is often one of those really difficult things. I think that menus, again, encourage a classroom environment of responsibility and accountability for all the stakeholders. And again, it takes me out of being front and center, and it frees me up for help and holding small groups, mini lessons, and conferencing with students. One of the best things is that students that struggle, any struggling learners you have in your class, they have access to more resources to aid in learning the content. So if they're, for example, choosing to watch a video and they're like, you know what, I'm not really getting what I need from the video, or I feel like I need a little bit more context, they can go to a different choice. Your advanced students have access to enrichment, and enrichment section is always something that I include in my menus. And then if your students are absent, they know exactly what was covered during the class and their activities because you'll be putting dates on your menus. So I split this presentation up into menu creation and menu implementation. So we're going to focus a little bit right now on the parts of a menu and how I divide it up, and I'll be showing you some artifacts from my classroom. So every menu looks very similar in that you first start with some sort of learning modality, right? Choices for how to learn. And then I incorporate some sort of practice or self-assessment choices for practicing the new learning. And then finally, we come into a formative assessment, which is a reflection of learning. And this could be synchronous or asynchronous, depending on whether or not you want a little bit more control over when your students take these formative assessments. So we'll be exploring all of these in this session. So here's an example of my menu on ionic compounds. I have used this with both my honors chemistry class as well as some aspects of it in my college prep chemistry class. So we're going to explore the anatomy of the menu and all the things that I include in a menu. And again, this is just works for me. So you may find something like, you know what, that's not really going to work for me. You can completely modify it. And I've included templates that you can use also. So those will be included in a Google Drive folder. So every menu starts out the same way with a title at the top, and then of course the learning objectives. So what my students need to be able to do at the end of the menu. Okay. Notice I only have 6 objectives there, but you can absolutely put more in there. I probably wouldn't copy the entire CED from like the AP chemistry curriculum, but I would say try to narrow it down to at least like 5 or 6 objectives if possible. The other thing that I do is I name the sections corresponding to the topic that I'm teaching about. So for example, in this case, I was doing a properties of ionic compounds, and this was a required section of the menu. It just makes it a lot easier to reference what part of the menu your students are going to be working on for the day. I also include the date at which the menu is due by. This is typically the day that it's due at the end of the class period. This again gives students some guidance of a deadline, but any remaining time that's left over, they can move on to other sections of the menu. If they finish early, they can go on to an enrichment section. But usually I've gotten pretty good at judging how long it's going to take to complete a menu. I also include a section for, just checking off that it's complete, but also students use this section for asking any questions that they might have in that section. So they can come to me obviously during class time because I'm freed up for help. And then it's always important to specify which activities are required. I have a professional learning community at my high school. And so we have a team of 5 other chemistry teachers. And so we share resources that way. And that's how I create the bulk of my menus. So I would go to somebody and say, hey, like, do you have anything to teach about ionic bonding? And they would say, oh yeah, I have this great simulation with questions and things like that. So I really feel that your PLC is your best resource to build a library of choices. The other thing that I highly recommend if you're trying to implement this in your classroom is assess your students after each section of the menu. And again, this could be synchronous or asynchronous. It really just depends on the class level and if your students need more structure. Formative assessments do not numerically impact the student's marking period grade. However, they are imported into my online gradebook just to give the students and the parents an idea of where they fall in terms of their understanding and achievement with that content or skill. And then my formatives are typically half sheet formatives, and I'll show you an example of one momentarily. So that way it's not a real big drain on your time for grading. Just you could have it be a half sheet or a quarter sheet quiz, something like that. But this is just, again, to check in with the students. Do they understand what they've learned? The other thing that I talked about earlier is providing enrichment. So enrichment opportunities are great for students that tend to finish things pretty quickly. It allows the students to, again, reflect on the content that they've learned, but it gives them a little extra something, like maybe I'll do like a team activity like you see here, or a lab experience. And usually what I do is I pull from my honors, for my honors students, if I have a menu in honors, I pull from my AP. For my CP students, I will pull from my honors. The other thing that I try to include in every menu is a catch-up date. So if students were absent, or maybe they need a little bit more time to digest the content or go over formative assessment results, I do provide usually some sort of review date or catch-up date so that the students can get the help that they need. And then also to promote accountability and responsibility for the learning in the menu, I always identify the date of the summative assessment. I've been doing this for about 4 years now, so I'm pretty good with being able to tell when the summative assessment would be most appropriate. I will say the first couple of years I was doing menus, I was like, oh, that took a little bit longer than I expected. So I did have to do some modifications. But I think that making sure that you identify the summative assessment date helps the students to recognize that they are going to be held accountable for the information contained in the menu. Now, whenever you're differentiating, there's really 2 ways to differentiate. You can differentiate for process, like in terms of the learning modality, right? How your students are going to meet the desired learning objectives and targets. But then you can also differentiate in terms of product, right? In terms of the assessment. So how will you know that your students met the desired learning targets? And we already talked about formative assessments and summative assessments a little bit, but we'll dive into that in a little bit later. So we're going to focus on some activities, and I just want to check the time. We're doing okay. So one of the ways that I love to assess my students' understanding is by using something called Tarsia. And I don't know if anybody uses this, but on your screen and in the Nearpod screen, these are clickable and draggable pieces. And so this is a jigsaw puzzle of different types of learning. So I wanted to give you guys a moment. And if you click on the piece, you'll see a little circle that appears. You can actually rotate the piece. So feel free to rotate it. I did try to get you started over on the right-hand side here. See if you can match this up. I'll give you a couple moments. It's probably good for a brain break too, because I know I've been talking for a while. So like I said, these are just some different choices that I use pretty frequently in my classroom for assessments and for learning modality. Usually it is a physical puzzle that I do with my students, like with actual pieces that they can move around. But obviously in this digital world of remote learning, it's made it kind of difficult. So I've been using Tarsia pieces like this to create digital puzzles instead. Looks like we got some of them. Let's see. If you're interested in using Tarsia in your classroom, again, I did include some digital templates for you to use in the Google Drive folder, and you can modify them.
Karen, am I supposed to be able to click on this and get something to happen?
You should be able to click on the pieces and move them. Yes.
I can't. No, I can't do it.
Are you on the Nearpod screen or the Zoom screen?
Oh, no, I'm on the Zoom screen.
Okay, that's probably why.
Never mind. I understand
No
now.
worries,
Okay.
no worries.
Not a problem. Not
Happens all the time.
a
So for the interest of time, I am just going to copy and paste right over you guys here. This is what it should have looked like when you're done. So I'll leave this in here so you can kind of look at it, but this is what the puzzle would look like if you were all finished. Great. I got a question about where is the Nearpod screen? Are you good? You can access it. There you go. Okay. So that's what it looks like. But you have lots of choices for things you can do. You're welcome. You have lots of choices and shapes and things that you can do in Tarsia. Okay. So let's talk about differentiation ideas for modality. So the ideal learning modality criteria should be such that it teaches identical content. And I know a bunch of you said that you're worried about equity in the choices. So I will say that if there's something that I just simply can't find a choice for, it's a required assignment. It's something required. And then as the years go by, I slowly build my library or I create another choice that would teach that identical content. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I can't find a choice, so I'm gonna just make this assignment required. I've done that plenty of times, especially when I was new to creating menus. The other thing that you want to consider are some time constraints. Now, I would never want a student to be penalized because they chose to do something that would take a little bit longer time. So always make sure that at least the deadlines are appropriate for the different activities that are involved. Obviously, like a lab would take longer than maybe a simulation or a worksheet. So you do want to consider that, but again, you can absolutely use that buffer time, that kind of day before the assessment, to allow the students to have some extra time with things if they need to, but that is something to think about. You do want the learning modalities to be student-centered learning experiences. You want your students to be able to do these things independently without a lot of supervision. Obviously, the caveat with that is if you're doing a lab, you do want to supervise your students, make sure. So when I'm doing a lab during like class time and there's like a lot of things going on, I'm usually hanging out in the lab area, supervising those students in the lab. So that's the only other thing that you want to look out for. You can also provide learning modalities that are partner work or individual learning. And I think that's important for Collaboration, obviously we want our students to get those soft skills, work on those soft skills with interpersonal skills. So I try to incorporate partner and individual learning activities in the same menu as much as possible. And then mini lessons are a great time for the students to work with me one-on-one. Typically, I'll do a mini lesson if some of the students perform very poorly on their formative assessment. I'll bring them to the back of the classroom and I'll have like a little like whiteboard set up, and I'll be working on a whiteboard with those students. So that's what I mean by a mini lesson. Now, my go-to learning modalities are videos, textbooks, card sorting, animations, simulations, labs, POGIL, articles, foldables, and manipulatives. I'm going to just show you some examples from my classroom. If you obviously have any questions, obviously I can answer them. But I do in my classroom more of the in-flip approach, where my students are working on videos in class. They use Edpuzzle to keep track of their progress, and I use Edpuzzle to keep track of their progress. I encourage all students that are engaging with Edpuzzles to take notes. I embed questions, and then at the end of every Edpuzzle, there's always a question there. Do you have any questions? Usually while the students are working on videos, at least during unit menu time, my students are able to call me over and say, hey, Ms. R, what did you mean by this? So I'm able to help them. But if they're completing an Edpuzzle outside of class, that do you have any questions piece is important so that I can respond to them outside of class. The textbook is something that I use not very often. I'm using it more as a vocabulary introduction. I can obviously assign readings if you need some questions for assessments. That's a good thing to use. I try to incorporate a non-tech based choice when possible. This is especially important now, I think, when we're all just like so connected to our computers. This is something tangible that they can hold and read, and they appreciate that. Again, this is something that I encourage them to interact with by taking notes. This is a staple on my unit menus. It's not a very popular option, but students always appreciate the reference. In fact, most students use this, I would say, at the end of a unit menu to just, again, get some more context and read over things as they prepare for their assessment. If you don't have a physical textbook, CK12 is a wonderful resource that you can use to, again, provide another resource for your students. This is an example of a card sorting activity that I do with my intermolecular forces unit. Card sorts are great. You could absolutely use them to review content, but I use them to introduce content. So this is how I introduce some of the different intermolecular forces. This is great for, again, engaging your students in learning science by doing science. So they're looking for patterns, they're sequencing. You can differentiate these too, right? We're all talking about choice and differentiation. You can remove cards or add cards in if you have students that are struggling learners, or just kind of like, it's just like information overload, or you can add even more cards if you want for, higher level students. Animations and simulations are wonderful. This is really great in terms of teaching content a different way, but still teaching the same exact content. You can use this for modeling. It's great for there are like tutorials and things. If the students don't want to watch a video, they can do a simulation to learn about the content. The only thing is you want to be careful, because Google Chrome obviously can be a little finicky with some things. You'll probably want to, I don't have a Chromebook that I use. So sometimes what I'll ask my students to do is just say, hey, does this like sim work on your Chromebook, just to make sure. So that's always something you want to look out for. Always include a way for the students to interact with the simulation. So if you've noticed, like with the textbook and the videos, you always want to provide or suggest a way for the students to interact with the learning modalities. My favorite science sim sites are PhET, SimBucket. CK12 has a great library of resources for simulations, and then Chem Collective. Foldables are wonderful. I know a lot of people are like, oh, really? I know they seem kind of middle school-esque, but not really though. Their kids love them. I don't do it all the time. The kids love them though, because it helps, again, it's an interactive thing to organize their notes. I provide different choices for templates. It just helps them to summarize the information, and then they just glue it in their notebook. Like I said, I don't do it all the time because it kind of loses its luster, but I think that it really helps to, again, encourage the students to create something, right? Creativity is important. Labs don't have to be done on lab day. Out of all the learning modalities, students gravitate towards this one the most. This is wonderful, especially if you're limited equipment. I usually will set up 3 or 4 lab stations for the students to work on the lab. This is a great way for the students to have some, one-on-one attention with you and work with their peers. So I would encourage you, even if it's just setting up a little mini experiment, just a real quick thing, students really enjoy that part of the menu. And then articles, I love Chem Matters for this. This is just a great way to incorporate phenomena into your classroom. Chem Matters has some great questions that are already made, some anticipatory sets of questions. So if you haven't already done so, definitely check out Chem Matters. Scientific American is another one. And sometimes, and I don't know if you can see or you actually saw this, but Compound Interest is another wonderful resource. I just print out the infographics and put it at the lab station. The students can read that and answer questions based on that as well. And then as far as manipulatives, I don't use these as often because I don't have as many models, obviously, but I love to identify some sort of phenomenon and have the students use the model pieces to, just kind of work with and understand the phenomenon. And I always include, again, some guiding questions. The picture there that you see are my it's the 3D molecular design kit. It's the cup of water. I love that kit. I don't know if anybody has them, but I use that to explain the dissolving process, the ion dipole interaction. So it's a great thing. I love pulling those out. The kids really enjoy them too. So number one question I get from teachers is, Karen, you create all of that by yourself? And the answer is no. Again, my PLC is my best resource for compiling choices. And like I said, if you don't have a choice for something, just make it required. And then as the years go on, maybe you'll create something or find something. So let's talk about some assessment ideas. So these are, again, we talked about the learning modality. So they're learning the content. Now they have to self-assess. So here are some, so before we kind of jump into the actual things that I use, I'm going to ask you to think about what's your favorite way to encourage students to self-assess? What ways do you have your students practice the content? You can just type it down in that text box there. Oh yeah, I was going to say Kahoot. Oh yeah, quizzes is so fun. Great. I don't know what GimKit is. I have to learn about that. Yep. Ooh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I would say the more immediate feedback, the better. So you guys are all using things that give pretty immediate feedback. Ooh, I'd be interested in your self-reflection sheets. I always struggle with that myself. Fantastic, great. So as far as ideal criteria for self-assessments, you'll notice that it's very similar to the learning modalities. But again, you want your students to practice with the content, right? They're going to learn it and then they got to make sure, hey, I got this, right? So this has to be student facilitated, again, with minimal supervision. Partner work, this is when really the classroom is very lively for me. The students are working usually in groups. Some choose to work by themselves, which is fine. I want to respect those introverts. But it's very important for the students to take a moment to reflect on their progress. Like, do they get it? And so that's something that you want to think about. And so that's why I was saying that self-reflection sheet sounds really interesting. But the way that I kind of make sure that my students can reflect is by providing answer keys whenever possible. Usually it's, for me with answer keys, I don't want to just give it right away. I have the students engage with the content or the practice, and then I give them the answer key. And so the way that I provide answer keys and practice to my students, just like many of you mentioned, worksheets. I love partner practice. I don't know if you noticed this in my puzzle earlier, the Tarzia puzzle. One of my favorite things to do is have two sets of, I guess, two sheets, right? And so they pick a partner and then the answers to, for example, partner A's sheet is on the back of B's. and the answers to B's is on the back of A's. And so partner practice is kind of fun because they can kind of look to see what they got wrong. QR codes are great. Like when my students are doing Tarzia puzzles, again, I want them to work through the puzzle. I don't want them to have the answers right away. So what I do is I walk around with pre-created QR codes. And when the kids are like, I'm done, I'll give them a QR code for them to scan. Google Forms, right? That could be self-grading. Whiteboarding is great for make thinking visible. Jigsaw puzzles, I already talked about Tarzia. GIFs are wonderful too, especially if they're just, again, they're videos that don't have any sound in them, and it's just kind of replays over and over and over again. So I will sometimes link to that using a QR code. Any kind of self-grading quizzes are all awesome for assessments. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and click your choice. Are you still with me? Pick the emoji that best describes how you're feeling about using menus in your classroom. All right. Just waiting on a few more responses. All right, let me share the results here. Not doing too bad. Not too bad. At least nobody picked the crying face. Okay, great. So a lot of teachers, when they take my PD, they're like, how do you sleep and eat? So if you're feeling overwhelmed, I get it. I do. So here are some things that I can suggest to start small. Okay. You can provide only assessment choices, right? So you don't even need to do learning modality, right? All the learning modalities will be required to provide only assessment choices. You could provide only modality choices. Okay. And maybe you're like, I don't know if I can create an entire unit menu for my entire unit. That's crazy talk. You may say, you know what, I'll do choices for a single lesson, right? So that's something that you can say, you know what, this is our agenda for today. You have a choice. You can do it this way or you can do it this way. And then that's the end, right? So that's one way to kind of dip your toe in the water. For me, I've been doing this a long time. So I would say for learning modalities, I could have upwards of 2 to 3 choices for things. But honestly, you don't have to go crazy with that. Use what you already have. So if you have a worksheet, you can make a choice. You can make 2 choices out of that. You can have your students do the worksheet, or you can have your students choose to do their work on a whiteboard. That's a choice right there. You didn't have to make any changes to the worksheet at all. You're still going to use the worksheet, but you can have your students work on a whiteboard instead and maybe work with a partner, right? If you have a lab, just convert that into a little station learning thing. If you have notes, have your students create a foldable, right? If you have a quiz game like Kahoot, you can use that automatically as a formative assessment. So you don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel, but I would say that dividing and conquering within your PLC, if possible, is a great way to get the choice that you want into your menus. Now, the other thing that I wanted to show you, again, some artifacts from my classroom. I'm really proud of this. This is my second year teaching AP chemistry. I don't know if you would really count it as this is my second year. I taught AP chemistry like 7 years ago. And then I was like, oh, AP chemistry teacher retired. So I'm up. So this is a menu that I made for my AP students. So notice that this isn't actually teaching new content. Instead, it's reviewing content. So I show you this, and you should be able to scroll in there and look at it. But I just show you this because all of these resources were not created by me, right? If you look at these, I did create the ed puzzle. Okay, give me that. But I had my students read over some exam tips. I had them use this crash course book that I purchased for my students. I had them read over some FRQ tips. So none of these things I did not create myself. All of these were just compiled for the students. So you can even use menus to review content. All right. So then the other thing that I want to show you is you can, instead of maybe doing a whole menu, you could do a choice board. So this was something that I did in remote learning in 2020. I would say in like April. And so this was something that I did with my honors chemistry students. This were some lab, they were really missing the lab experience. So what I decided to do was make a choice board for just, labs with solutions and involving solutions. And so if you click on the different, like the different sides here, you can see that there's all different lab activities that the students were able to choose from. And then besides choosing from the labs, they were also able to choose the way that they wanted to be assessed. So I was able to come up with different ways for the students to, again, pick their assessment piece. So I'm pretty proud of this. It took a lot of time to create because this is the first time I was really ever doing a choice board, but it was really worth it. The kids had a lot of fun and it was a great, I think, use of time, and it definitely helped to mix things up a bit. So this choice board, I do have a template that, again, I'm going to share with you. Again, this is good, especially if you teach younger students, like if your students are a little bit on the younger side, or again, you don't feel comfortable necessarily making an entire menu. This is something that you could absolutely use just to give a few choices to teach a single concept, right? So that's another option for you as well.
Karen, can I ask a question?
Of course you can, yeah.
Back on the previous slide, you had a lot of complete this form. Do you have like a common form that you use for a lot of your independent work?
Yeah, so this year, I can't see what my students were doing in front of me because there were so many students at home. So to keep the students accountable for review, I sent them a form each day to basically say, how's it going? What are you working on? Stuff like that. And I actually did that. And I'm glad you really brought that up, Sue, because that's actually what I did with this choice board as well. The choice board that I was just showing you, I sent them a form every day just to check in. How's it going? Do you need any materials from me? Things like that. I don't do that when the students are in front of me because I can see what they're doing. I can see what they're working on. I actually walk around with a clipboard, which I'll talk about in a second, just to track student progress. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking. And I'd be happy to share my forms if you want to. So don't be shy. Let's talk a little bit about how I implement them, right? We have to control the chaos, but it's so fun. So like I mentioned, I'm one of the only teachers doing this in her classroom. And with that, it's like, ooh, it's new, so it must be bad. Right? None of my other chemistry teachers are doing this. So she just must be the weirdo. I find that my students are becoming more accustomed to it, and your reputation precedes you, right? My students are like, wow, Miss Randazzo is very innovative. She spends a lot of time creating resources for us, and they enjoy it now. But at first it was a little bit of I was on the struggle bus. I'm not going to lie. So I think these are some phrases and things that you can have in your back pocket if you do start using this with your students, right? You want to make sure that your students understand that it's not about what you as their teacher can do. It's about what they can do. This is their classroom environment. We want this to be a really exciting place for them to want to come to and enjoy. And so saying to your students, this is about you taking ownership and autonomy for your learning. It's not about me, it's about you. And very often, the number one thing that I hear back from students, especially students that have gone to college, they're like, wow, I'm so glad you used this strategy in the class because this is exactly what I'm experiencing in college, where my professor gives me a syllabus and they say, this is what we're doing. I think, again, that phrase of you are learning how to learn is so important to share with your students. The other thing is to say, you know what, I'm doing this because I care about you and I want to be able to help you learn the content more easily. Again, using that piece of saying, hey, if you're struggling, you have multiple methods to learn and practice with. And then I always talk about the enrichment section. And then I always talk about being absent. You know, they know exactly what you did in class. So you'll notice that this is very similar to one of the first slides that I showed you with why are menus so great, right? This is what you say to your students. This is what you say to your students' parents. This is why menus are so great. And this is why I'm doing this. Here are some menu norms that I use with my students. So this is something that I actually print on a piece of paper and give to them, right? Read, read, read. So important. Complete each section thoroughly. Like the students need to understand, like, again, this is about responsibility for your learning. You need to complete it thoroughly. It's not about getting everything done as fast as possible. You need to make sure that you're on track and you're getting this and you're interacting with your peers and you're interacting with me. Encouraging students to speak up and ask questions. Now I tell my students that dates indicated are firm. You might want to do that too, honestly. You don't want them to think, oh, she'll just push it back or he'll just push it back. No, no. Dates indicated are firm. You are held to this schedule. You'll have more than enough time to do it just as long as you're on task. That's the important thing. You don't want the kids screwing around during class time. You want to make sure they understand, like, again, you got to get this done. And then that formative assessment piece, I talk a lot about with my students, how they should be using the formative assessment results. Formative assessments are a component to the students' learning. Formative assessments are what I say are informative and should be used to guide the students' efforts. So if the students are not earning passing scores on these formative assessments, it's really up to them to say, hey, Ms. R, can you work with me on this? That is such an important piece to the unit menu approach. And that's something that you really want to be very explicit with your students about. How should they use that data or that feedback that they're getting back? The other thing that I think is worth noting, in my gradebook alone, I had almost 50 assignments in marking period, for example, 3 or 4, it was one of those. And I would say 6 of them, 6 were summative in nature. So it's more about feedback than about grades. And that's another big shift. Okay, I guess that's probably another presentation for another day. As far as tracking student progress, all required assignments are documented in my online gradebook as formative assessments. They do not numerically impact the student's marking period grade. I use what I call formal formatives, which I'll show you what those are momentarily. And then these are, again, all included as required items on the menu. I use a student tracker, which I also included a template for you. It's made it a lot easier for me to track what the students are doing. I walk around, I'm very official with my clipboard, and I put more time on task with a question mark there because it's almost like, oh, they know she's coming. She's watching what I'm doing. And I literally write down stuff like, what are the kids doing during class time? This has helped me also to determine which choices students select more often so that I know what my students like and I can include it on subsequent menus. Here's an example of a student tracker that I use. This was for my unit menu on the mold. This was my CP chemistry students. And so you can see I'm just kind of checking off, is it complete? Did the student do it? I have, comments in there. Sorry, I'm not sure how small or how big it is on your screen, but that's what it looks like. I didn't, like I said, include a template for you all to use as well. And then as far as sharing, I print out the menu on colored paper. It's easier for my students to find in their binder. You're probably like, Karen, why are you printing? And if it's online, they like it. They like it printed. I don't know. I just do what they like. You can also share via Google Classroom as a material. If you're new to menus, I would probably recommend, and this is actually what I did with my AP menu, I would share it as view only, and so that viewers may not print or make a copy. And that's important, especially if you need to make changes. That way you know that your students are only going to access the menu from that point. You don't want them to use an outdated version. If you don't know what I mean, I can show you. I also have a Google site that I use with my students. You can post it on a Google site. It's up to you, but I tend to like Google Classroom for it. That way the students, again, can't make copies of it. Let's talk a little bit about formal formatives. So formative assessments are administered again after each section of the menu. Students take them as if they were taking it in a summative assessment scenario. Oh, I'm running out of time. I will say that again, for the formal formatives, I highly suggest that your students spend time doing their formative assessments as individuals and not working with anybody else. That way you can assure like what the students actually know. And then let me see what else I have left. That's a formative assessment example. All of these slides, by the way, are in that Google Drive folder. I'm just looking. I almost finished. All right, so what you have on your screen is a unit menu digital goodie bag. I've included all of the resources, including the template, the Tarzia puzzle, and the choice board template. Please reach out to me if there's anything else that you'd like from me, like if you want to see my Google Forms or whatever. And then is that it? Oh, this is something you can read on your own because I'm going to run out of time. But I want to say thank you for having.
Oh,
We're in a session now. Okay.
okay.
We do have a session now, yes, but I don't know that everyone's back yet. Yes, no, maybe?
I think the last room just closed, so I saw a whole rush of people come in.
Unexpected, yes.
The clock unfortunately stops from now on.
Yes.
So what is this chemistry year at a glance?
Yes.
Okay. I learned a lot in the coffee.
They're worth the hat. That's why we keep it open, because it's always so, you get so much out of those.
Karen, sorry, is your email on the resources you shared? So if we had any questions we didn't get a chance to ask.
I will put it in the chat now, and you can
Okay.
absolutely feel free to reach out to me at any
Thank
time. Yeah. Thank you all so much for attending Unit Menus.
Kristen, is there going to be a breakout for the session and then this is going to be the coffee house, or how's that going to work?
Coffee house is going to be the breakout room. The main session is going to be in here. So
Gotcha. Thank you.
Awesome.
I opened the coffee house breakout room. The way that you would get to it is you go to the bottom of the
Yep.
menu, click more breakout rooms, and the coffee house is open there.
Thank you.
Can somebody let me share my screen?
Yes,
The
I'm
host.
sorry. We just got back in, so I haven't.
No, you're good.
Make you, you had been a host in the previous version, but I think somehow that got.
I ended up leaving the session
Oh.
I was trying to get out of the breakout room and it's like, you left the Zoom call. I was like, that's not what I wanted to
that's
do.
So you should be able to share your screen.
Yes. Let's see. Hey, look at that.
You should be able to do that now.
Awesome.
All right, Linda, would you like, let me do a brief introduction. I'm just going to read the blurb. So this is our discussion, our presentation, Chemistry Year at a Glance. And Linda, I'm not sure quite how to pronounce your last name.
It's Detweiler, but that's fine.
I wasn't sure. Linda Detweiler was a chemistry and physics teacher for 10 years. And now she is the customer success manager at Pivot Interactives. And she is doing several presentations. This is her second back-to-back presentation with us. When she's not presenting at conferences, she is active in the chemistry teaching community, helping teachers gain access to awesome chemistry resources. And we're very glad that she is here with us for this session.
And I promise I'm not going to talk about Pivot in this session. So we're actually going to talk about something that I've been doing since well before Pivot. And I want to back up the story for a little bit. And I'm going to put that bit.ly will take you to the presentation, but I'm going to put it in the chat as well. It is case sensitive. It is build a YAG, and that will take you. It helps if I put the HTTPS in front of it. That'll take you to the notes for today. And one thing I do want to point out is pretty much everything I'm going to say with some extras is included in the notes under the slide. But I want to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart inside of chemistry education and education in general, which is lesson planning. And I think it's one of those things that as teachers, we do, and we do a lot, and we do it because our administration tells us to, or we do it because that's how we actually get through our day. But 10 years ago, I came into teaching, and I was teaching at the university level. So I was teaching organic. And when I taught the organic series, one of the nice things about teaching at a university is a lot of times you have the lab manual. And the lab manual has all the labs that you will teach. You will not deviate from the lab manual. You will do these labs. And so I kind of got used to that. And then I went into teaching at the high school level. And I worked at a high school in Central Florida. There were 5 chemistry teachers on the staff. I walked in the first day and I'm like, okay, I'm expecting some level of lesson plans, some level of materials, and got told like, good luck, don't die. Best of luck to you, new high school teacher. Here you go. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Despite the fact that I worked in a department with several other chemistry teachers, I had no success or support. And it was a very jarring experience. And so I was like, this is terrible, absolutely awful. No teacher should ever walk into absolutely nothing. And then I went to another school and I taught middle school science. And again, same exact experience. I walked into a middle school science classroom, no supplies. They were like, here's a textbook, good luck, nothing. And then I went to another high school and guess what? Same experience, military family, we moved all the time. And every school I went into, I was like, this is atrocious. Like, why is it that this is how we treat teachers? And so I decided I was going to start building my own year at a glance. And I was like, I need to make lesson plans. I need to keep track of what I'm doing. And at the time I had folders. And I mean like I had a file cabinet of folders. They were my baby. My pride and joy were my file cabinet of folders, each one of them labeled for the units. I had a folder for atomic history and every copy of I had page protectors with the student copy and the teacher answer key all inside of them. They were wonderful. That's how my chemistry teacher had done it. That's what she had taught me to do. That's what I did. And then I digitized them. I was like, ooh, Google Drive. It's like having a file cabinet, but it doesn't take up space in my classroom. And then the next year, I had started kind of saving all my files. I had a son. I have a son. And I woke up in the middle of the night to a really strange noise. And as a parent, I think we all know that feeling of when you wake up and something doesn't feel right. And my husband and I woke up and we couldn't figure out what the noise was. And then we realized that the noise that we were hearing wasn't a noise, it was a lack of a noise. See, our son snores like a Mack truck drives, and he wasn't snoring. My son had stopped breathing. We rushed him to the emergency room, and luckily he was fine, like he survived. But I got a call at about 8 o'clock that morning that was, where are you and where are your lesson plans? And then it dawned on me, I'm a teacher and I have to have lesson plans. And I had none of those. And I needed to be able to do everything in my classroom without being there. This was back in 2016. So before COVID, before everybody's really in the classroom, I was like, wow, I need to be able to give somebody my lesson plans. So I started building a year at a glance. And that's when I made this thing. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about when I say year at a glance. I made this thing. And this is what I'm going to give all of you guys today. In fact, all of my year at a glances are linked right here on the document. Here is my pre-AP, my standard chemistry, and that does follow the new College Board pre-AP curriculum, AP Physics 1 and AP Physics C Mechanics. But here's what I'm talking about. This is 43 pages of lesson plans. This is what I built. And this is what I give new teachers. They're really simple documents, but they take a long time to build. And it is my day 1 to day 180. Every single thing that I do inside of my chemistry class is inside of this document. What I love about building these documents is, as a chemistry teacher, when I get new chemistry teachers, I can say, hey, welcome to teaching chemistry. It's one of the best careers you're ever going to have in your life. Here are my lesson plans. They're not perfect. I am by no means a perfect teacher. This is a better starting point than zero. This is better than nothing. This is better than saying, hello, new chemistry teacher, good luck, don't die. That's terrible. The fact that we do that inside of chemistry is mind-boggling. And yet it happens in almost every single district across the entire country. So what the heck is a year at a glance? A year at a glance is exactly what it sounds like. It is all the things that I do inside of a year. I like making them digitally because they're easy to share with colleagues internationally. In fact, I've been sharing mine since I've been making them in 2016. So mine's been floating around for years. I think I've got somewhere near like 5,000 people have made copies of my Year at a Glance. I love that it's super compacted as one document. Everything hubs to one document. It's essentially a web page, but it's a web page that you can copy and edit on your own. They're really easy to search because it's a Google Doc. You can search it just like any other Google Doc. And they're super easy to download and send to your administrators. So every year my admin team's like, you need to use our lesson plan format. And I'm like, lol, no. Here's my 44 pages of documents on day one. I hand that to them. My admin looks at it and goes, okay, cool. And then never asks me about lesson plans again a day in my life. I did that on year 2 inside of high school teaching, and my administration was just like, cool, I don't ever have to ask you about lesson plans. I don't care that it doesn't match our format. I know that you've got it. And they left me alone. That was one less thing that I had to do. And I'm going to give you guys a template for making your own. But my goals today are to talk about how do you make one of these beasts, because if you look at it, the lesson plan one that I have for chemistry is 43 pages. I did not make that overnight. I've been working on that thing for 5 years now. The one for AP Physics is probably somewhere in the 60-page range. Like, they're big documents. So we're going to talk about how to make one and then hopefully give you all the tools to start making your own. So the process for making it is fairly simple. There is a little bit of a startup point, and then pretty much everything from that point on is just updating it as you go. But when I make a Year at a Glance, which I'm going to be making one over the next few months for AP Chemistry, because I get that request all the time. So I'll be making a completed AP Chemistry course the same way. And it's a fairly basic process, but I start off by identifying what are my standards, what do I need to teach, what do I want to teach, if my standards are a little bit more fluid. I set up my days per standard so that I know how much time I should be spending on it. I mark my units and I place my assessments, and then I place labs and activities, and then I place notes, and then I rearrange and modify and save. Something that I should note is the way I develop my course is through a method called backwards planning. And so we're going to talk about backwards planning and how it's a little bit different than forwards planning. And I just want to make sure that I reiterate this over and over and over again. This is not an overnight process. You will not make a Year at a Glance in a day. You will not make a Year at a Glance in a week. Yeah, I doubt you'll make one in 30 days. These are things that you build over time. Like when you look at this document, when I look at this chemistry document, my 4 Year at a Glances comprise of 50 gigabytes of documents. If you've ever looked at a single gigabyte of PDFs, you'll know that those are thousands of PDFs. I have 50 gigabytes of just PDFs. So we're not talking about, oh, there's like 100 links on here. No, there are over 20,000 links inside of each one of these documents. These things are hefty documents. This is not something that you make in a day. This isn't something that you make in a week. This is something that you build over the course of years. And what I love about that is that they are things that you constantly keep building on. So this thing just gets better with time. So this is something that you make it once and you just tweak it as you go. And eventually get to the point where you don't need to tweak it that much. So I'm going to start off with the first part of this process. I think it's probably the process that everybody starts every curriculum journey they're ever on, but we always start off with naming our standards. The last state that I taught in was Kentucky, and Kentucky uses NGSS. 36 states inside of the country use NGSS, and the other ones that don't use NGSS, they just don't call it that. So like Florida does not teach NGSS. They teach the Next Generation Sunshine State Standards, which are the exact same thing as NGSS, just branded differently. New York does the same thing. So do states like Texas. They just need to be fancy and have their own name on it. Okay, fine. It's all still NGSS. So I start off by identifying my standards. Kentucky uses NGSS. They're just the NGSS standards. And then I rewrite my standards so that I can identify them and my students can identify them immediately. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the first standard that I'm looking at. This is HSPS 1-1. It is atomic theory. Next generation science standards teach atomic theory. So this one just says, use periodic table as a model to predict the relative properties of elements based on the patterns of electrons in the outermost energy level of atoms. Short, sweet, to the point. Problem, it's a little too short. This is a performance expectation. From the NGSS, a performance expectation is the task that a student should be able to do at the end of a unit. So when the student has successfully learned chemistry, they should be able to use the periodic table as a model to predict the relative properties of elements based on the patterns of electrons. There are a lot of key pieces of information that students should be able to do in order to get to this point. But this standard by itself, this isn't the end all be all standard. This is a task that the student should be able to accomplish. To go with these performance expectations, there are these. This is an evidence statement. If you've never seen an evidence statement before, let me blow your mind when it comes to NGSS. The next generation science standards, if you've ever looked at the framework, that book is pretty thick. It's a solid inch. That thick book actually breaks down into hundreds of pages of these evidence standards. This is the evidence standard that goes with this tiny little performance expectation. Little tiny performance expectation, all of the actual standards that go with it. These are the standards that I teach my students. When I think about what a unit should be when it comes to the atom, I'm going to go into the evidence statements. And these look more like traditional evidence statements that you would see inside your classroom anyways. For example, it says, from the given model, students should identify and describe the components of the model that are relevant for their predictions, including elements in their arrangement on the periodic table, a positively charged nucleus composed of both protons and neutrons. Gee, that sounds like teaching the parts of the atom. You mean with NGSS, I should still teach the parts of the atom? Yes. The amount of people I've talked to that say, well, I don't teach the parts of the atom, that's not an NGSS. Or I don't teach electron configuration, that's not an NGSS. Yes, it is. It's very clearly stated inside of the evidence statement. If you go into the evidence statement, you will find the actual content that your students need to be taught in order to be successful. So when I get all of my standards, I'm using these evidence statements. But that evidence statement's still a little rough for my students to read. In fact, it's a little rough for even me to read because they have these like fragmented sentences that are broken down into multiple different steps. They get a little crazy. I want my students to be able to readily look at the standard and say, that's what I need to be able to do. By the end of this unit, I need to be able to identify the parts of an atom. So what I did was I took each of these statements and turned it into an I can statement. So for instance, this one says students should identify and describe the components of a model that are relevant for their predictions, including the elements in their arrangement on the periodic table and the number of protons in each element. So I turned this into an I can statement. So if I come to my year at a glance, I'm going to go to unit 1. What I did was I said, here is the statement from NGSS. It says, using the periodic table, students can identify and describe elements in their arrangement in the periodic table. Note, students are not expected to memorize the elements. So that is specifically from NGSS. My students are not expected to memorize the elements. So I don't require memorization of the periodic table inside my classroom. I turned that into an I can statement. Given clues about an element, I can identify it on the periodic table. That's a pretty common chemistry task. And it's a very straightforward statement for my students. Given clues about an element, I should be able to identify it on the periodic table. What kind of clues? Clues like, this element has 6 protons. What element is that? It's carbon. Based on the atomic number, we know that atomic number is equal to the number of protons. I can make that prediction on the periodic table. That's an application of that skill. It falls directly inside of my performance expectations, which is aligned to the evidence statement. I include these points here so that my administrators will know, how did I come up with these I can statements? These aren't just I can statements that I pulled out of thin air. This was, I took the evidence statement, I turned them in a student-friendly language. Each one of these points comes from each one of these points on the document. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 points. Each one was broken up into I can statements. And I assess each of these standards individually inside my classroom. So there are 10 standards here. Each standard is assessed within my classroom, and they're all based on that evidence statement. Now, this takes a little bit of time, not going to lie. This process here, taking your statements, turning them into I can statements, hopefully you're given these with your textbook or your curriculum, but if you aren't, this can take a few days. In fact, I did this for NGSS, and this took me about 3 days to do all of my standards. But I go ahead and do them all before the year starts. I turn all of my standards into I can statements so that I have a feel for what my full course is going to look like. I need to see it all kind of laid out there. That's also a great point, that as you're going through these, you're going to readily identify things that you've already taught, things that you've been teaching for years, things that you already have supplies for, or you already have activities for. So for instance, the periodic table, I've always done a periodic table scavenger hunt. We do like a bingo game. The kids get little bingo markers. I name out clues. They mark them on their periodic table. First one to get a row or a column shouts out bingo. And so we've played some kind of game with the periodic table for years. I'm still going to do that. I'm not saying that when I build one of these year at a glances, I'm going to start everything from scratch. I'm just starting my planning from scratch. So I'm going to continue to use some of the activities that I've always used. I'm just going to align them to the new curriculum. Now, once you've got your number of standards laid out and you know how many standards you're going to teach, you need to identify how much time you're going to spend in each unit. And that can be a bit of a hassle. A lot of it comes down to a feel. I think as a chemistry teacher, discussion of the matrix, I'll jump back to that one. A lot of it comes down to a feel for how much time you'll spend in there. And as a chemistry teacher, you'll get a better feel for this over time. If you've been teaching for a long time, you know that teaching the parts of the atom, depending on if your students had a strong physical science background or not, could take you anywhere from 3 days to 8 days. Just getting through parts of the atom, electron configuration, and maybe periodic trends, top 2.5 weeks. 3 weeks, maybe. I know that because I've taught chemistry for 10 years. I've had 10 years of students where I've had to teach them periodic trends. And I know that periodic trends takes forever because students don't like to memorize the periodic trends. Fine. I know that teaching the parts of the atom doesn't usually take long. I just need to get over the misconception that protons always equals electrons because they get that in biology. Cool, I can address that inside my classroom. But if I'm starting off and I need to figure out how many days am I going to spend, I just take my true number of instructional days and divide it by my number of standards. So what the heck is a true instructional day? True instructional days are 80% of your course time. 80% is a pretty important number. We're going to assume that 20% of our in-class days are lost. Those are days like start of school when your administration tells you that you can't teach anything content related, or snow days where they're supposed to be learning at home, testing, field trips, prom. The day before prom, my kids aren't doing anything except discussing who's going to prom and who's not going to prom. I'm not getting a whole lot done that day. Or all of my students went to an FFA field trip. Nobody told me that they were going on an FFA field trip, but half my class is gone. I'm probably not going to get a ton done that day. All of those days we're going to account for by saying that that's part of our non-instructional time. We'll still do instructionally related activities those days. We're just going to allow those to be kind of in that flexible day range. These are also days like you need to go to a conference. You're sitting in an IEP meeting. You get sick because you're a human being and you're not a robot. You need to miss school for whatever reason. You don't have to feel bad that you're losing that day. You've already accounted for it. And the number of standards, I usually do this based on the number of I can statements, but if you want something like, if you're teaching an AP course, this could be the number of topics within a unit. So this just allows you to adjust for your number of days. Generally speaking, you're going to come up with a number that ends up being about 3 I can statements a day or about 1 to 2 standards a day. So you're going to have maybe 15 to 20 days inside of a unit, all depending. Now, something that also should be considered when you're looking at these units is, what do your students know before they come into class? And that's where progression matrices can help you. If you've never seen a progression matrix, I highly recommend that you check them out. There are progression matrix for NGSS. And as College Board is creating these pre-AP programs, we can see what the pre-AP expectation is for these classes. So we can get a feel for what our students should have learned in the previous course. If you're teaching a course number 2 inside of a sequence, vertical alignment can be really helpful here. But this is just where you look and see, what should my students know before they come into the class? What are things that I can expect my students to have known before they got to me? I taught in a state where science education isn't done until middle school. So in Kentucky, a lot of schools don't start science until 7th grade, which means that a lot of learning about science isn't there. They don't know the parts of the atom. They've never had electron configuration. So I need to teach a lot more inside those units, which means I need to spend more time there. I often look at these matrices. Oh, that one got moved. I'll have to update that link. Let's see if this one got moved. Oh, cool. It's still there. But I can look to see what are the expectations that students should have before they come into my class. So I can see, for asking questions, by the end of 6th grade, they should be able to do all of these things. So if my students can't, that tells me what I need to go back and focus on to build their skills to get them ready for high school. Some kind of pre-assessment early in your year is going to help you to really hone in on what they can and can't do. But once you've figured out your units, so once you figured out your units, you're just going to place them on a basic map. And this is what my basic map looks like. You'll notice there are 9 weeks in each column because there are 9 weeks in a quarter at my school. I taught on quarters, not trimesters or semesters, but you're going to map this out to match your school's course sequence. If you teach 4 quarters, have 4 quarters. If you teach 2 trimesters, have 2 trimesters. If you teach 1 semester, 1 semester. However you teach your class, that's how you're going to lay out your weeks. And then just place your units on there. Here's what that looks like when it's done. It is the first page on all of my documents. Whoops, not on this one. I have a soapbox there. Boom, that's what it looks like. And it's just me saying, in week 1, I'm going to be inside my intro to chemistry unit, and I'm going to be there for 3 weeks. And then I'm going to be in my periodic tables and trends unit, and I'm going to be there for 3 weeks. You'll notice I also have these wiggle room placed in there. At the end of week 16, I'm generally butting up against winter break. And I'm saying that I should be done with thermochemistry before winter break. But I would start on reaction kinetics right after that. I'm not going to start a unit mid and then have winter break right in the middle of it. But I do know that I'm going to have some wiggle time in there, and that I'm going to have all kinds of things happen. So I'm going to allow for some extra time for just wiggle room. And that allows me to kind of shift my units as I need to, as long as I get through unit 4 by the end of Christmas. Laying out this little glance quick view doesn't take long. 5 minutes, maybe 10. You're literally just placing them on there. As you go throughout the year, update this. Make your adjustments so that you can see like, oh, this is how much time I spent. What's really helpful about this is that when you get to the end of the year and then you get to next year, you can say, am I on track based on where I was last year? So I can say, yes, I'm still moving at a good pace, or I'm going really fast, I can slow down, or I've spent too much time inside this topic, we need to move on. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions before I just keep moving on here?
I just want to say that I really like how you got this overview and then you can link to the units and those exact activities, et cetera. So it's a really nice way to think about it. I know when I first started teaching AP, I had set, it wasn't nearly this detailed, but the idea of the map of here's what I'm going to try and accomplish, say, on a weekly basis.
Mm-hmm. And then you can just jump to it. And that's the nice thing about it being a Google Doc.
Right.
You could just hop right to it.
Right.
But so, yes, I heard my name.
And yes, that was your name. I was wondering, I just want to ask you a little bit of advice. I'm taking on a new curriculum challenge. I've worked in curriculum a long time, and I really appreciate you sharing this with us. This is so helpful. I'm creating a foundations class for chemistry.
Yep.
But not just chemistry, kind of like a mixture of the sciences, like just to, I'm making the assumption, the big assumption that the students coming in really don't have a background necessarily.
Yeah.
In science. And they're from other countries, so they definitely need help.
I was just about to ask you that question. Have you heard of the Access textbook?
I have not.
Let me show you this textbook. Let me see if I can access science textbook. So I have this textbook somewhere behind me. It is that one right there. This textbook is wonderful for ELL populations. It is called Access Science. It is an introductory science course. It is aligned with the middle school standards, but you can pair it up, bring it down based on whatever you need to. It's written for students who do not speak English. So it uses very introductory language. It also defines a lot of the common English words that we just assume people know, like measure or spoon,
yeah,
or paper. Like there's a lot of just English language skills inside of it.
Yeah.
Super awesome textbook. The activities in it were on par with what I was doing for my English language learners. And I love that it introduced science skills that I didn't think about introducing. So things like density, what's mass? Like, let's back this density boat up all the way to the beginning of what's mass? What's volume? How do you measure mass? What's heavy and light? And like, I spent a day with my English language learners just on picking up 2 items and going, which one's heavier? And practicing the English skill of heavy and light.
Thank you for sharing that. I took a quick picture of it. I'm going to go and see a copy of it somewhere. But
I think I might have, and send me an email. I'll put my link in the chat. I started a course using that textbook, and I should still have the document somewhere. So when I find it, I'll make sure to add it to these notes, but definitely email me. And when I find it, I'll send it to you.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Absolutely. So let's talk about actually planning out the units, because this is the part that goes pretty quickly. I plan out my units by planning the entire course first, And then I know what's going where. So I know that atomic history is pretty early in my course, but it's actually not my first unit. My first unit is an intro to science unit on density. So we spend about 3 weeks just going over basic intro to science skills. So I know that I don't need to do that in my atomic theory class. So I can focus on atomic theory over here. Something else that I also do at the beginning of the year, one of the first activities I do is I write the final exam. And I write the final exam before I do anything else for the course so that I know what I'm assessing my students on at the end of the year. I know every skill that they need that they're going to be assessed on so that when I take my class and I do the class, I know that, hey, this skill is going to be on their final exam. So I do that same thing when I'm unit planning. The first thing I place is the exam, and I usually write the exam fairly early into the unit. So a lot of times the first thing to get written inside of a unit is the exam itself. And I've done other presentations on this at NSTA and places, but to give you an idea of what one of these exams looks like, this is an NGSS aligned Unit 1 exam. They are story exams. They are a very involved process to write, but each one of these exams covers all of the expectations within the unit. So I write this exam first. Once I have this exam written, then I'm going to plan the course. Once I know what is the story that my students are tackling, in this case, it's identifying an element off the periodic table. Once I know the story that I'm tackling, I know what skills I need to teach my students. So on that planning sheet, I place my exam first. I'm automatically going to carve out a day for the assessment. I also tend to carve out a day for what I call a work day. Work days are exactly what they sound like. They are days for my students to do work. That's the day where my students work on their review. They get any work that they haven't turned in. These are some of the most productive days inside my classroom. And they're super important because in my class, the last day that I accept late work is the day of the assessment. Once I put that test in your hand, your late work is no longer accepted for the unit. So you have up until the day of the test to get your late work turned in, because past that point, this is your summative assessment. All of your work is supposed to inform your learning up to the summative assessment. Once we get to the summative assessment, we're not going to do formative feedback on things that you've already been summatively assessed on. So I have a workday, and I did link my workday form to there and the review to there. But once I've placed those, the first thing that I ask myself is, what experiences am I going to give my students to prepare them for the assessment? So in science class, experiences are labs. And so I'm going to place my labs. And a lot of times when I'm planning these things out, I'm just putting notes on here with it. So for instance, I start my atomic theory lesson with this Discovery Squares activity. It's one that I found online years and years ago. And so as I'm writing it, I'll go find that URL and link it to the document and be like, hey, you're going to write an activity that goes with this. Or I always use the build an atom FET, because despite all of the recent advancements inside of science, I still do not have the ability to just grab protons, neutrons, electrons, and shove them into an atom inside my classroom. One of these days, I will get a handheld nuclear reactor and I'll be able to do this inside of my classroom. But until said time, I guess I'm going to have to use a simulation. How dare I? This is a wonderful simulation. I've used it since the start of my course. I'm going to keep using it forever. It's great. And it's free. So I put that one on there. I have this atomic mass of candium activity, which we do average atomic mass calculations in my class. We make a batch of candium. It's a super rare, delectable little element. It comes in a variety of isotopes called Skittles, M&Ms, Reese's Pieces, sweet tarts, and what was the other one? I usually find like some other little small candies, mix them all together and give my students a 1 ounce little cup of candy. I've also seen this done as beanium. You can do dried beans. I like Candium because afterwards each student gets a 1 ounce cup of candy and then they get to eat them. So this lab does cost a pretty penny, but my kids like eating the candy afterwards, and I get to send them hyper back home because that's what parents do to us all the time. When they give us those kids hopped up on coffee and on energy drinks, I give them back kids that are hopped up on sugar. That's how that trade-off works. But I put a note on there like, I can't find this. It's in my Google Drive. Go find it in your Google Drive. I'm just putting notes inside the document for me. So I just place, these are the labs that I want to do. Notice I don't start with notes. I very rarely start a unit with notes. Usually I have some kind of discovery activity. But once I've placed my labs, I ask myself, what other activities do I want to do? So I think back to the I can statements. And in this one, I need to be doing percent composition. I need to be doing calculations. Anything that's math related, I need a day of practicing the math. So I go find my activities and I place those on there. I know I'm going to do a day where we just calculate percent composition. I know I'm going to do a day where we work on percent abundance calculations because that's going to take them a minute. And atomic mass calculations, I'm going to need that. I've also went ahead and placed my quizzes on here because those quizzes are opportunities where my students are going to get a chance to assess their knowledge and get feedback on it. So I put those quizzes on there. And these are finished quizzes. I actually put together this presentation, obviously, after I've made it. So I just left the links on there. But a lot of times I just say, I'm going to quiz these standards, and then I go write the quiz. Or I'm going to do this information, and then I go write the quiz. This is something that I learned, and I've edited this since I last did this presentation 2 years ago. Download everything that you find online and put it into a shared Google Drive. Not just a Google Drive, a shared Google Drive. Here's the difference. When you're inside a Google Drive, you have My Drive and then you have shared drives. You want to put everything that you do inside of your school district in a shared drive, not My Drive. The reason for that is if you are on a business or an enterprise Google account, you cannot transfer your drive. It's not possible. So you have to move everything to a shared drive. I did that back in November when I left my district. It took 3 days to move everything over. And I had to pay for my upgrades. So make sure that you put everything into a shared drive. When you put it into a shared drive, you can just remove your district level email and it'll always move with you. So always put things inside of a shared drive, not My Drive. That way you don't have to rearrange everything. I'm still recovering from having to organize all of those files. All that organization was lost. It was literally like taking everything that you had inside of a file cabinet and pouring it into a box. It's painful. And as I'm placing these activities, I do use virtual labs. Obviously, I work for Pivot Interactives now, but I've been using virtual labs even before I was with Pivot. But I'm going to place my activities, and a lot of times I'll place out like, how do I want to do the activity? So I know I like doing tabletop practice. I like doing gallery walks, whiteboard swaps. I'll just put little notes like try out this or let's do this, like little quick notes for myself. The last thing I put on there is my notes. And I usually write my notes as I'm putting them on there. That's just me. That's the kind of teacher that I am. If I'm not writing my notes, I'm finding them in my Google Drive. But this is what my unit plan looks like before I start school. And a lot of times there are no hyperlinks on here. So during the summer, before my students get into the room, I've planned this out. I've placed the items on there. As I'm teaching the course, I'm going to update them along the way. So as I'm teaching the course and I find the Discovery Squares activity or I make it, I put it on there. As I make the PowerPoint, I put it on there. As I make the notes, I put it on there. I put the homework on there. I put everything on the document. I even include days that I wasn't there. So for instance, this ends up being right near the start of fall break. At the beginning, at the midpoint of September, late September, there's usually an FFA field trip. I would add the FFA field trip to my calendar and say, hey, all the kids were out this day, because next year it's going to be about the same day. So I know, hey, there's a field trip coming up, be prepared. Any of those big cycle things that happen year after year, I put onside my calendar. It gives me something to look out for. I usually email the FFA teacher and I'm like, hey, you had this last year. Do you have this again this year? And they go, yeah, we do. I was totally going to email everybody about it, but I forgot. Cool. Now I know. As I'm building these, this is what it looks like at the end. Here's the final unit. I've got things like, here's the actual document. Here's the teacher version. Here's the answer key, which, by the way, find the copier in your school and then figure out that it's a scanner. So this is what my scanned version look like. My answer keys aren't typed up. They're literally my handwritten answer keys. I print out my work for my students and I print an extra copy for me and I write on it. And then I walk over to my scanner and I scan it, email it to myself. Yeah, there are apps on your phone. I lived at my printer. I probably printed more things inside my classroom than most teachers do. But I just hand wrote everything and then scanned it and uploaded it. And that's how my answer keys are on here. And then I saved them. Every time I made an answer key, I had a folder on my desk that said keys. And once a month I scanned them and uploaded them. And then once they were scanned and on the document, I'd verify that I had them on the document, verify that the link worked, and then throw them away. And now I don't have to make the answer key again. The answer key is on my document. I also include anything else that I do related to it. So for example, I was doing this and I took a grad class on atomic theory and they were like, write a paper about how you do this thing inside your classroom. And I was like, okay, cool. That's the paper. So when I share this document with people, I'm like, here's 6 pages on how I teach this lesson, including all the questions I ask and why. So I have more information than you ever needed for this activity. Thanks, grad school. I put those kinds of commentaries on there. I put, if an answer key isn't needed, why it's not needed. So for instance, this massive Candium activity, I don't grade it because every student's going to get different answers and the answers are going to change every single year. So it's a formative assessment. It's something that we do to introduce the concept to my students, and I treat it more like notes. So I put a note on there that it's formative. Now that I work with Pivot, I've started putting Pivot versions of activities on here, like the ones that auto grade. Answer keys. I even put my retests on here. So for instance, the students didn't do well on one portion of the test. They really struggled with, ready for this, the percent abundance and the percent composition, the math, that heavy math stuff. So I put the retest on there so that next year, when I need that retest, it's already written and it's unique from the assessment. So I'm not just saying, here are the original questions again, do them again. I can give them a unique testing opportunity. And I build on this for years. So in this unit, in addition to all that, I also have a section that's called additional activities. If I'm not using an activity anymore, I never delete it. I just copy and paste it down into another area. So for example, periodic table of aliens, super fun activity. I didn't want to use it one year, so I moved it out of the way and I save it. I never delete anything. It always just gets moved to a different area. So if I have extra time or I have a wiggle day that I need to use inside the unit, I have all these backup plans. If I have an unexpected sub day, here are all my sub day lesson plans. If I need additional resources, here are all my additional resources. If we change standards, here are all my things. Because chemistry is chemistry is chemistry. If we change standards, it's really just a matter of, are we teaching gases this year or am I teaching nuclear this year? That's pretty much the only change that ever happens inside of chemistry. And where am I going to teach reactions? Because apparently pre-AP teaches reactions as the last unit. And then I just save these things over time. And I've continued to add things. So like over time, I've picked out the vocabulary words that students need to know within a unit. I've made a list of all the materials that I need for units. And for some units, I've even started linking the Amazon cart for the specific density cubes that I use, because I lost a set one year and I spent 20 minutes hunting on Amazon to find it. So I put that on there. All I'm doing in this process is just helping future me. I'm saying like, hey, future me, I did this year and you might have to do it in the future. So here you go. It's on the document and everything can be in one location. And then when I get a new teacher, I can just say, here's my bit.ly link, hop into it. And they don't start at zero. Everything is right there. And so they know exactly what they need, exactly how I do it. Heck, I've even started putting like soapboxes on why I teach things the way I teach them and what things mean. So I've added all kinds of stuff to these over the years. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. So if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Linda, this is Jerusha.
Hey.
Good to see you. You know, this is great. I think that organizing all my stuff is just something that is just so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that really resonated with me was kind of the list of alternative activities, because you know, you come to these NEAT conferences and you get so many great ideas, and you can't always use them every year, but that doesn't mean you want to forget them, or it's not
exactly.
Or you know, maybe you're not teaching honors this year, but in 2 years you will be, and then you'll want something a little bit more advanced than your CP, but less advanced than your AP or whatever. And so like having an easy to access document that has everything in it in one place. I mean, it seems like a tremendous amount of work to put it in, but it seems like the payoff is really incredible, especially since not linking to websites where you could lose the link is no longer working. You're linking to your own documents, and therefore you know that those links will always work.
And I think that's the funny thing too. Like when I first started doing this, I was like, wow, this is going to take me forever. Like this is a year at a glance that I'm working on for physics E&M. And this is what it looks like to start with. And yeah, this takes a little bit of time. Like the longest thing for me was honestly copying these learning objectives from College Board. But going and finding these different things, it takes a couple of minutes. But it sounds really crazy. The document, once you get it started, it's just maintenance. I think the starting period for this took me about 4 days of honest work. So there's about 30 hours of startup time to making this over the summer. And then the rest of it was just daily maintenance. I have this thing, I have it bookmarked at the top of my browser. I'm on it every day. During the school year, I was literally on here every day making updates. So when people were like, can I have a copy? I was like, sure, but your copy doesn't update. So you definitely want to just add the bookmark to this thing and just come back to the original. But I mean, I was literally updating this daily. And if I'm doing 5 minutes of updates every day, then I'm going to get, here's my stoichiometry unit. And there are all the extra things that I've ever done with stoichiometry. Or I worked with, have you heard of collisions? Did I put them on this one? No, I probably put it on my pre-AP one.
By the way, Collisions is presenting on Wednesday. So make sure.
Oh, is Jen presenting on Wednesday?
Yep.
Collisions is wonderful. Like if you haven't heard of Collisions, go check them out. They're great. But I love Collisions. So I put their stuff on here. And I've just added it whenever I found something, I was like, oh, go check this out. Or I'd put a comment on my thing, like this one says, hold off on this one. I just constantly put different notes on my standards. And you can see this one's a mess because I was rearranging it for the College Board units. But I've just always been rearranging and rebuilding and just working off of the same documents. This thing has been in the process of building for 5 years now.
Linda, I have a
see.
question.
Yeah.
What kind of document do you provide to students? Like a
That's a really great question. So on my document up at the top of them, usually you find this little thing that says unit tracker and tracking sheet. There it is. This is what I give my students. This is my tracking sheet. It's just the NGSS standards and the accompanying ICANN standards that go with it. But I give them the learning targets and their vocabulary. And what we do is I print these 2 to a page. So they end up taking about 45% of a half page. And then they paste these into their science notebooks. And we add notes around it. And before the assessment, I ask my students to go through and rank their understanding of the ICANN statements. So I don't actually give my students reviews. Their review is to go through and show proficiency on every one of these ICANN statements. So I teach them, if the ICANN statement says given clues about an element, I can identify it on the periodic table, then their way to know if they can do that is quiz their buddy. Hey, this element has 14 electrons and it's a neutral ion. Cool. Then it has 14 protons and it's this. What is that? No, that's not magnesium. I don't have my periodic table in front of me. I moved. But so I just have them quiz them, or I can define the shells of an electron as well as the valence shells, shells of an atom. So that's their expectation. That's what their review is. I give them these at the start of the unit. And as we do things, I have them write in their notebook. For learning target 1.1, we took notes. For learning target 1.1, we did the build an atom simulation. So they can come back and say, oh, I need to practice this skill. It was in this activity.
Thank you.
I see a question that says, how do you manage old copies of your YAG or worksheets and notes? So I don't ever make it old copy. If you notice, this is the pre-AP one, and it's a hot mess because it says begin old standards. Last year, while I was still in the classroom, we switched to College Board's pre-AP chemistry program, which I could rant about that for days. And I had to completely revamp this thing for College Board standards. And so what I did was I put a little header that said begin old standards. And then I made my new one. And I've been in the process of moving all my old things up. Or for example, I taught AP Physics 1. AP Physics 1 lost units 8, 9, and 10. So I just put a little note that said no longer in AP. Here you go. And just moved them. So I don't ever make a new copy. I just keep making modifications to the same old one and just move things over time. That's why some of them are 77 pages. They get a little messy. Using headers and keeping track of your toolbar on the side is really helpful. Old notes and worksheets, if I ever really truly update notes, then the old ones go down here. So you can see I have activities and worksheets. Here's all of them. Old notes down there. As I'm finding old ones, I move them out of the way. But a lot of times I will modify my old stuff to make it more acceptable to the newer things. So it's very rare that I just completely start over. It's more likely that I'm going to take something that I had and tweak it to make the new one. But I see I have about 1 minute left. So I definitely want to say, if you ever have any questions or you need any help in any of this, I'm always just an email away. Feel free. You can email me at the Pivot one. You can email me at my personal email. I answer to both. I'm on practically every chemistry group known to man. I am one of the administrators for National Chem Teachers on Facebook. If you haven't joined, I highly recommend it. We're a super great bunch. There's like 8,000 teachers in there. So you're sure to find lesson plans for whatever it is that you're teaching. Awesome to see people on the different social media groups. You will find all kinds of resources on them. But if you ever need anything, always feel free to send me an email. I love helping anybody with anything. So I'm always just an email away.
That was so helpful and informative. And I think a lot of people are going to really start thinking about how they want to approach this. Thank you, Linda, so much for presenting twice today.
Thank you for having me twice.
We were happy to do it. And I think we're taking a break now until 7. We'll meet up again at 7 for social hour and prizes and just maybe a little wrap up. And then we'll go into the Tim Award presentation with Dr. Shakashiri. So you definitely do not want to miss that. Chris, do you have any other comments before we close?
No, I think we're good. Thank you, Kristen, so much. And thank you, Linda, and all the presenters today. It really great first day kickoff. And I'm really looking forward to this evening, like I'm sure most people are. I think it's going to be amazing.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.